Welcome to the Lost Boys of Found Fathers podcast. I'm Gabe O'Sullivan, and joining me is my co-host Will Haycox. We are men who have suffered the loss of a child, and through this production we desire to offer encouragement, strength, and hope to our fellow brothers who have traveled the same journey. Good morning, Will.
Good morning, Gabe.
So we're going to let Will intro us and kind of get us back on track from where we have been the past few episodes and where we're going today.
Sounds good. Thanks, man. Yeah, good morning, guys. We're excited to get episode 17 out here, as long as our count is correct. If it's not, we apologize. We'll go and count again. It's been about a month since we've recorded again. I think that's correct. So we are just trying to get something out to you and get rolling again. If you've listened to everything before this, you'll know where we are. But if you're just jumping back in after a long break like we've had here, kind of what we ended up last time was just talking about a quiet time, a Bible study, just the importance of that and what that is. I think we have some of the resources on our website or on our social media about what a quiet time looks like, and some of the the guidance that comes from our church on what a SOAP style Bible study is. That's scripture, observation, application, and prayer. We talked about our pastor who'd written a book about how failing to do a quiet time is something that can lead to a life where you feel like you're leading it on your own and you're not trusting in the Lord. And if you take care of that sin of omitting your quiet time, that it makes it easier to deal with the sins that you're committing day to day. And that's certainly been true for Gabe and I. And we just kind of finished up last time with, if you truly love God more than you love other things, you'll make time for Him. And again, that might sound harsh, but that's just the way human hearts work, is you make time for the things that are important to you. So if you're not in a place where you're having an intentional relationship with the Lord, then maybe you need to sit down and do a heart check and figure out why that is. So going forward here in episode 17, finishing this little mini series we've started, our question here, or our topic to start with, is the importance of doing a quiet time and why it's a helpful thing for you, not just in your relationship with the Lord, but in your relationship with your wife, your friends, your family, your co-workers, and it just overall will make you an easier person to be around, a kinder person to be around, and the ultimate goal is to make you someone that's made in the image of God, and that you will glorify Him with your life. So that's kind of where we are. It's a quick, simple, easy topic that I'm sure we can just breeze through in 5 minutes. So no, it's an important thing that we all need to take time and focus on. So it's something that we're excited to get into here. So just to jump right into it, we talked about the importance of quiet time last time, and the biggest thing that we just discussed is the closest to God will enrich your life and make you a new person. And that seems pretty intuitive if you think about like the people that you spend time with. Generally you end up becoming more like them, and so having a deep relationship with God will make you more like Him and will allow you to start thinking the way He thinks, and eventually that will make your life easier because you realize that you're not in control and you don't have to stress yourself over the daily worries you got going on. When you spend time with God and you grow to trust Him and you realize that He's sovereign, you realize that He is not going to leave you without things you need, and He'll provide for you, and you don't have to put so much stress on yourself as the provider for the family, the one that has to make all the decisions, the one that, you feel like you're juggling 15 things to try to keep everything going, and hopefully you have a good relationship with your wife, that you're balancing those responsibilities. But it's easy to feel like everything is on you, and if you take the time to get to know the Lord and to just pour into the scripture and to pray and to allow yourself to dwell on who He is, then you really realize that things aren't up to you, and that if you trust Him, He will guide you in those hardest decisions. So you really don't have to worry either about stepping on other people to climb to the top of the ladder at work, and that's something that you probably, if you're a good Christian and you are a conscientious Christian, that's probably a tough thing because you feel like, I don't want to do anything underhanded or inappropriate to get ahead, but at the same time, I need to get ahead. And where's that line? I need to provide for my family. So if I'm able to get a little further ahead at work, make a little more money, maybe I can provide for my family more. And doesn't God honor that? But if you read Colossians 3:23 and 24, it tells us, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. So everything you do is to serve the Lord. And if you're out there just looking for serving yourself, serving your financial interests, you're not glorifying the Lord and you're not trusting the Lord. So I think that's something that's been true in my life, Gabe, that if I'm focused on myself and I'm focused on like making more money or bringing home the bacon, whatever it is, it's easier to kind of get into that cutthroat attitude or just focus on like, what can I do to make a little more money here? Can I take a side job? Can I do this? Can I do that? And you end up either having a bad attitude at work because you're so stressed out, or you end up, and this is something I've been guilty of, kind of starting to say, well, if I take a little more time away from my family, I can make a little more money here, and that will help them in the long term. And so maybe we could deal with suffering a little bit with our personal time now. And if you have a right relationship with the Lord and you understand what Colossians 3 is trying to tell us here, you can understand that you're not working for men, and that includes yourself, and that your reward for your work and for your trust and your reliance on the Lord is the inheritance he gives us of being in heaven and spending time with him eternally, and we are serving him through what we do.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's a great points, and I think about, and particularly in this situation where we're dealing with the loss of a child, or coming out of that. One of the guys' go-tos, and I know mine was like, okay, I've got nothing left, right? Like, I'm just gonna go pull myself into work, or some other guy might be like, I'm gonna pull myself into working out, or I'm gonna pull myself into something else, right? And then we have that tendency to kind of forget about that relationship with the Lord. That's where we can really draw our strength from. That's where we can draw our significance from. That's where we can draw our comfort from. That's where we can draw our hope from. If we try to look for those things in other avenues, then we can become disillusioned, disheartened, frustrated, because all those things of the world, while they're not necessarily bad things, if we let them be our priority and they take precedence over God in our lives, then there becomes that that imbalance that is not healthy. So yeah, I'm with you. I think, and that's where you're saying is that daily time where we get focused every morning on, okay, let's focus on some time with the Lord first. That's going to help us set our priorities for the day, right? Or if you're just like, I'm not a morning person, I can't get up and spend time with God in the morning. Okay, every night before you go to bed, get your heart right, get your mind right for your next day, for when you go up. That way, we've got those priorities set. And I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we kind of talked about already in this little mini series about like intentionality, and that's an important thing that you mentioned there. If you just wake up each day and you're reacting to everything that happens and you don't have a plan, then it's easy to stop going to the gym because you feel bad that day, or to stop working hard at your job because your boss was a jerk that morning or whatever. And so even if it's not your fault that traffic's really bad and so you're going to be late for the gym and you don't have time, or it's not your fault that your boss had a really bad morning that day and he jumped all over you, you're going to end up reacting to those things negatively and ultimately hurting yourself and stopping your workout routine, and not being as good of an employee as you were going to be if your boss hadn't been a jerk that morning. And so if you, like you said, Gabe, if you start each morning intentionally in a way that you're going to spend time with the Lord, you're going to rely on him, you're going to be quiet and listen for his leading and what he's telling you through scripture, then you can be someone that's going out with a plan. And certainly there'll still be bumps and some misdirections and things that you go through each day. But if you have that plan you can keep falling back on, then you can have a much greater chance of getting where you want to go rather than just floating around aimlessly. So we don't have to worry about, being pushed off our path as far as stepping on others to climb to the top of the ladder. But in the same way, we don't have to concern ourselves with becoming the most popular person in our social circle. If that's more of your bent, is what you drive your enjoyment from, or like you said, Gabe, maybe that's one way of dealing with the loss of your child is just spending more time with friends, and that's a good thing. But Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 2:4-6, he says, just as we've been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. For we never came with words of flattery, as you know, nor with pretext for greed. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from people, whether from you or from others, though we could have made demands as apostles of Christ. And this is Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy writing to the church in Thessalonica, explaining that they didn't make demands on them, but spoke kindly and honestly on them in order to please God. So that's Paul there. If anyone you think would be like the center of their social circle and everyone's fawning all over them and they can make demands and they can be the cool, important person, you'd think Paul. Like he was the Pharisee of the Pharisees. He followed the law. He was obviously had an incredible relationship with the Lord. So he could have just sat back and been this mega pastor and, had so much influence over his friends and just used that for his own good. But instead of doing that, he says there down at the end, we didn't seek glory from people. So he was looking for glory for God, not even glory from God. And that's how we need to live as well, is not trying to build ourselves up or deal with our grief through feeling self-important because of our relationships. We need to realize that we aren't ultimately the center of attention and what's important, but God is. And that's something that both Gabe and I have come to deal with through the loss of our children, that it's ultimately not about us and our pain, and it's ultimately not even about our children. It's about how can we use the experiences that we went through with our children to glorify the Lord. And this podcast is an example of that, and Gabe's book is an example of that, and there's just several other things that when you focus your heart and you focus your attention on the Lord, it's easy to see positive results, where if you focus on yourself and your own glory, you might have some positive results at the beginning, but ultimately it's going to be about you. And I think without going into it, I think we can see that with several ministries that you have in the Christian sphere, that things are great, they take off, and then because one or two key people in that ministry are not really focused on the Lord but on their own glory, things ultimately come crashing down, and there's a lot of hurt that comes from that.
And I would say in that vein, just what you said a minute ago, Will, where if we look at this tragic experience of losing a kid as this whole thing about, woe is me, why would God do this to me, why would God do this to my wife, why would God do this to my kid, like if we start making it real internal and don't understand that, like you said, this is not about us, and this is not necessarily like some kind of punishment that we're necessarily suffering, from, that this is in some way, how can we turn this around for good? How can we make lemonade out of lemons? Like, that's what these experiences can be when we go through something that is very tragic and difficult. We can turn it into something good, and that will bring God glory, but that'll also give us fulfillment too, so that way we don't just internalize this and become like this, get on this pity party for the rest of our lives. We're like, okay, this was awful, but how do I turn this around into something good? How do I learn from this? How do I grow from this? How do I help my wife become, better through this? How do I help, other guys that might suffer this later? That's turning it around from being inward focused to being outward focused. And, it's like that, I always think about sports, obviously. That's one of the things that I'm passionate about. Even though my days of playing are done. I had not played basketball in a year, and I went like a couple weeks ago, and I realized why I hadn't played in a year. And it was so bad that like dudes were pitying me. I was like, now I was the old dude on the court, and they were like patting me on the back. They're like, "Oh, it's gonna be okay, man. You'll probably make your next one." And I was like, dude, I told somebody, this is totally off topic, but it's kind of funny. I felt like I was Frankenstein's monster, and that he had like sewn my hands on backwards and upside down, and maybe my feet as well. The first play of the game, I was trying to like box this dude out, and I started backing into him, and I couldn't stop backpedaling, and he like slipped me a little bit, and I just fell on my butt the very first play of the game. Because I was like, I hadn't backpedaled in like a year apparently, and so I was like, okay, I've lost all muscle memory and coordination, so I'm done. I'm gonna watch my kids play and be happy. I'm gonna eat popcorn now. That's what I'm gonna do. So anyway, back to what we're talking about here. In sports, like if we're only all about ourselves, then your teammates are just not going to be very happy with you. So it's not. You might have some success. Okay, we see that in the early stages of Kobe's life, Michael Jordan's life, even LeBron's life. But as they grew as players and they became, now were they very focused on themselves and their goals and their accolades and making and because they wanted these goals for themselves, absolutely. But when they became more team focused and figured out, hey, how can I make my teammates better? How can I set them up for success as well? If you're Michael Jordan back in the day and you got John Paxson on your team who's an incredible three-point shooter, okay, how can I draw the defenders to myself and then kick the ball out to Paxson who's going to make a three-pointer at the appropriate time, right? Like once that started happening, what started happening with the team? Man, they started rolling. They started winning crazy numbers of championships and games and setting records and that kind of thing. And so why was that again? This was because that person, that star player, and then I would say all the teammates there, it seems like, became less personally focused and more outwardly focused, okay, on how do we make our team better? How do we help the city of Chicago, look good, win championships, that kind of thing. And life turned around and they got better for them. Same thing in this situation, a tragedy like losing a child. If we internalize it and make it all about us and we think, this is all about us, then we go down this cycle of despair, right? But if we take a step back and think, okay, how can I use this to glorify God? How can I use this to make other people better? How can I use this to grow and then impact society in a positive manner? Man, it's just going to have a better outcome, Just like at work, like you said, if you're all about yourself, and your coworkers, they're going to see through that and they're not going to be happy. If you're like, hey, how can I do my job to make your job easier? How can I do my job to make this company better? Then all of a sudden you're going to start seeing great things happen. Your work experience is going to be better. You're going to start rising in the ranks, because people are going to see that you care more about them than you do about yourself. And that's the same way in this situation.
Yeah, that's great. That's pretty much exactly where we're going next. That focusing on having that pity party, like you said, will just ultimately drag everybody down, and it will just drag you down or keep you stuck in the same place. But when you become team oriented like that, by realizing that God's in control and your job is to glorify Him and to help those around you to deal with the same pain, you have that pressure taken off of you because of the sovereignty of God and how you are secure in Him as a Christian, and you know that He understands your pain and He's carrying you through it. So with that pressure off, you're able to give so much more of yourself to your wife and your children and your friends and your coworkers. And that's something that, like you said, is freeing. It's, what is it? I'm probably going to butcher this, but they say like a rising tide raises all ships or whatever. That's what came into my mind. I don't think I'm saying that right, but it's like, it's clearly what you were saying when you're focusing on building up the team in the sports analogy, or if as a father you're focusing on building up your family, and if excuse me, if it's just you and your wife and your first child or your first several children or who you've lost, that's something that you just have to focus on, building up your family. And we talked about that with Mr. Grant. Like, a family isn't you and your wife and kids. A family is you and your wife, and you are building up, and of course when you have kids they're added, but I'm just saying specifically when it is just you and your wife, that's still a family. But when you're focusing on your problems, your pity party, your hurt to the exclusion of everyone else's, you're going to become self-centered and self-focused. But when you try to build up your family, you will not only allow your family to flourish and to be who they need to be, but you will end up dealing with your problems, and things will be easier for you than if you were just sitting around feeling bad all the time. So Ephesians 5:25-30 says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. That's we could have a few episodes probably just on that passage and all the ramifications that come from it, and
I think
husband, wife. We probably will, yeah. But just specifically what we're talking about right now, like, says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And Christ didn't love the church enough to write her a note in the morning or to take out the trash or do a little bit. Like, if you love your wife in that, like, solid but kind of like when it's convenient sort of way, if if Christ had gotten to the Garden of Gethsemane and sat and thought, like, the next couple days, like, I'm going to be executed, I'm going to be tortured, I love the church, but I don't know, that's a lot to go through for the church, so maybe I'll just go and I'll talk to Pilate, and I'll fall on his mercy, and I'll just say, you know what, you're right, man. I'm not going to push this. Let's let things play out. I don't want to make the Jews mad, and then they'll execute me here. And if that's what Christ did, and that's the example we're to follow, then sure, yeah, take out the trash, do a little bit of yard work, keep your wife off your back. But God didn't send Jesus to give a good showing and then give up when things get tough. He sent him to sanctify us, to cleanse us by the washing of water, to cleanse us of any spot or wrinkle, and make us holy and without blemish. And that's not something that he can do simply, that he did do simply. It's something that took everything from him. It took that suffering, that pain, that torture, and ultimately his death and his resurrection. So we need to try to love our wives that way by, just like it says there, sacrificing ourselves for them. And that's certainly something that I don't do perfectly. Gabe, you and your wife been married longer than my wife and I, but you probably don't do it perfectly either, just because we're humans and we are not capable of living perfectly as Christ did. But that's something to shoot for. So, like I said, the love that Christ displayed to us is not a love that does enough to get by and then stops and is lazy. That's a love that wakes up every morning seeking to find new ways to show your love and a way to care, like it says here, verse 28, in the same way husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So if you love your own body, whether you're working out and you're trying to build your body up, or whether you are just resting because you're tired and you love the rest and the relaxation that you get, you should love your wife that way and care for her mentally, physically, spiritually, and do everything you can to make life easier for her, to show your love. You're willing to work in order to care for her, to support her, to build her up, pray with her, listen to her, have hard, honest conversations with her about finances so you can get in a better place in the future, about what you're doing in your career so that, again, you can have the best work-life balance and a better future. You're willing to sit down and have those conversations about how you're dealing with your grief over losing your child, because that's a conversation that might be and probably will be hard and uncomfortable because you may be on different pages, but Christ didn't deal with us to a point that we rejected him, as humans rejected him first, and he was like, this is hard, I'm out. Like, no, he gave grace to Adam and Eve after they disobeyed in the garden. He brought Israel back to him when they rebelled, when they were in Egypt, when he brought them back. Like, one of the first things they do is like, cool, thanks God, we're building a golden calf and we're going to worship it. Like, if God was the kind of God and displayed the kind of love that we do as husbands, just as humans, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have the lives that we have. We wouldn't have the opportunity that we have to trust the Lord and to come to know him, because he would have just walked away when things got tough, like a lot of men do to their wives. Mm. So the kind of love that you're able to give when you're a believer seeking Christ is the love that he gives you. And if you allow him to speak through you, the kind of love you have is one that will continue to give even when it's hard to give and hard to love. And you chase after your wife when she's going through hard times, you're going through hard times, or you're both going through hard times. And Christian love is not based on emotions, but on the love that God gives you and the covenant promise that binds you and your wife. And we talked about a couple episodes ago the quote from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. And that quote, just in case you forgot it, is do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the great secrets. When you're behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love him. And it's directly applicable to just put your wife in there instead of your neighbor. Like our world, I think we've talked about this before, Gabe, but our world is so focused on like my feelings and, you know, you do you and all this stuff about like if you wake up in the morning and you don't feel like going to work, then just stop because it doesn't bring you joy. If you're working out and it's too hard or your trainer is pushing you too much, you don't have to do that anymore. You know, you do you have your joy. And it's a same token, like the world is just all about this, like, oh, we fell out of love. You know, it was great and we were high school sweethearts and we've been together for 23 years, but you know, people change and you know, life is just tough sometimes and we just fell out of love. So it's okay. And people like, instead of like, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, people would have been horrified. Like, I can't believe you'd even mention that in public. And now it's like, well, you know, I really want what's best for you. So if you think, you know, you falling out of love is something that, you know, is best for you, then sure, you probably didn't feel that love. So there's no reason to fight for it. But again, we've said here, Christ fought for the church and he suffered for us. He went through the hard times for us. So just like this quote from C.S. Lewis, when you are going through those tough days, when it's hard to love your wife and you don't feel that love for your wife, and even maybe when she isn't being lovely or lovable, which will happen because you married a sinner and she did too, you need to be intentional with your love and with your sacrifice for her. So you cannot truly give up your life and be willing to sacrifice everything for your wife unless you're being filled with the Spirit of God regularly through your own personal Bible study. And the most important reason, I think, to do a Bible study is to be drawn closer to the Lord. The second most important reason is to be the kind of man who can sacrifice everything for your wife and build her up and help her become who she can be if she has a husband that fights for her and sacrifices for her like Christ did for the church.
Amen, dude. That's awesome. And that's like that last little point, like you said, that's where we draw our strength, is from spending that time with the Lord. Because when we read the Bible, one of the things that you keep coming back to is like this idea or this truth that even though we are sinners, Christ loved us, right? Even though we, as people, have continually walked away from him, ran away from him, even like you mentioned, set up idols in place of him, he still has that heart for us, right? And so that's how we kind of develop that understanding of, man, okay, if this is the way God loves me, then that's how I should love others too. And that obviously is going to greatly impact our relationship with our wives, but also with other people. So yeah, another great word. Right, said a great reason for why we want to take that time to draw near to the Lord and then realize that he'll draw near to us.
Yeah, guys, thanks for joining us for this little mini series here, and we appreciate your time, and we hope that you are taking that time to do a personal study of the Bible and just drawing closer to the Lord, because like we said, the most important thing is that you're drawn closer to him, and when you're drawn closer to him, you're able to be the man you need to be to love your wife and your children well. So thank you for joining us. Make sure you follow Lost Boys to Found Fathers on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can check out Gabe's book at thywillbedonebook.com. Let's not be lost. Let's be found in him.